The police cruiser's red and blue lights painted Sarah's driveway in accusatory colors as Officer Martinez stepped out, his hand resting on his radio. Behind him, Margaret Thornfield stood with her arms crossed, her HOA clipboard clutched like a weapon of righteous fury. "She's in direct violation of municipal codes," Margaret declared, pointing at the empty concrete pad where Sarah's above-ground pool had stood just hours before. But as Sarah opened her front door, holding a thick manila folder that would expose 20 years of Margaret's own violations, the neighborhood Karen had no idea she'd just triggered a war she couldn't win. The twist that would destroy Margaret's reign of terror was already in motion, and it started with a simple into her driveway, her Honda Civic's headlights cutting through the gathering dusk of what had been, until 30 minutes ago, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening. She'd been looking forward to a quiet night, maybe ordering Chinese takeout, catching up on her favorite Netflix series, and finally tackling the stack of architectural drawings that had been collecting dust on her kitchen table since last week. Instead, she found herself staring at a scene that belonged in a suburban nightmare. Margaret Thornfield stood in the center of Sarah's backyard like a general surveying a battlefield, her silver hair pulled back in its signature severe bun, her red blazer pristine despite the threatening weather. In her manicured hands, she clutched the infamous clipboard that had become the stuff of neighborhood legend, a weapon of mass HOA enforcement that had homes and flee to less regulated suburbs. But it wasn't Margaret's presence that made Sarah's stomach drop. It was what surrounded the HOA president for other board members, Janet something or other, who always looked like she'd just bitten into something sour. They were taking pictures. Lots of pictures. What the hell? Sarah muttered, killing the engine and stepping out into the drizzle. Margaret's head snapped up at the sound of the car door slamming. "Moused Miss Chen," Margaret called out, her voice carrying across the yard with the authority of someone who'd spent the better part of 2 decades making other people's lives miserable in the name of community standards. "How fortuitous. We were just documenting your latest violation." Sarah felt her jaw clench. She'd been living in Willowbrook Commons for 8 years, and in that time, she'd received exactly 17 citations from the HOA. 17, she kept them in a folder in her kitchen drawer, organized by date and type of supposed infraction, grass too long by half an inch. Mailbox paint inconsistent with approved color palette, it was black instead of dark charcoal. Holiday decorations up beyond the acceptable time frame she'd left her Halloween pumpkins out until November 3rd, and a dozen other petty complaints that had cost her thousands of dollars in fines and forced improvements. "What violation?" Sarah asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. Margaret gestured grandly toward Sarah's backyard, where her pride enjoyed a beautiful 24-foot, above-ground pool that had cost her 3 months of overtime and her entire vacation. Fun sat nestled between her newly planted rose bushes and the wooden privacy fence she'd installed last spring, Section 4.7.3 of the Willowbrook Commons. Margaret recited, her voice taking on the sing-song quality of someone who'd memorized the HOA bylaws like scripture. And Section 4.7.3 specifies that all such structures must be aesthetically consistent with the neighborhood's established character and property values. "It's not permanent," Sarah said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how weak they sounded. "It's an above-ground pool." Margaret's eyebrows arched. "Because, according to our measurements," she gestured to one of the polish-shirted men, who held up a measuring tape like a trophy, "your pool deck extends beyond the acceptable setback requirements, permanently plumbed into your home's electrical system." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She'd hired a licensed electrician to install a dedicated GFCI outlet for the pool's filter system, exactly as specified by the manufacturer's safety requirements and local building codes. The pool deck was modular and could be disassembled in a few hours with basic tools. "I followed all the safety codes," Sarah said. "I got permits from the city. Everything is legal and up to standard." "City permits," Margaret said with a dismissive wave, "are irrelevant. What matters are community standards." The entire world was a personal disappointment to her. "The board has reviewed photographic evidence and testimony from concerned neighbors," she said, consulting her own clipboard, for Sarah's voice cracked with disbelief. "Unauthorized structure," Margaret ticked off on her fingers. "Improper setback compliance, unapproved electrical modifications, and She paused dramatically, clearly savoring the moment. Creating a potential liability hazard that could impact neighborhood insurance rates. Sarah stared at them, beginning to soak through her work clothes. 8 years of this. 8 years of Margaret Thornfield finding new and creative ways to make her life hell. But this was different. This was her pool. The pool she'd saved for. The pool she'd researched for months, comparing models and reading reviews and watching YouTube installation videos until she could probably build one from scratch. The pool that had given her the first real joy she'd felt since her divorce 2 years ago. "What do you want me to do?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Margaret's smile widened. "Remove it, of course. You have 72 hours to dismantle the structure and restore your yard to its original condition. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $500 plus the cost of professional removal at your expense. $500 a day." Sarah's voice rose to nearly a shout. "That's insane. That's the penalty structure for major violations," Janet said primly. "It's clearly outlined in Section 12.4 of the Enforcement Guidelines." One of the polo-shirted men, a guy named Dave or Dan or something equally forgettable, stepped forward with a manila envelope. "Here's your official notice," he said, not quite meeting Sarah's eyes. "Everything's documented. Photos, measurements, witness statements." Sarah took the envelope with numb fingers. Through the clear plastic window, she could see the HOA letterhead and the words "violation," notice "immediate compliance required" in bold red type. "This is harassment," she said quietly. Margaret laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "This is community governance, Ms. Chen. Some people understand that maintaining property values requires sacrifice from everyone. Others, ... She looked pointedly at Sarah's pool, her expression suggesting she'd just spotted a dead rat in her garden. "Others seem to think rules don't apply to them. Every citation you've given me has been for ridiculous stuff. Half-inch grass, paint colors that weren't even wrong. Holiday decorations, that rules are rules," Margaret interrupted. "And this community has standards. High standards. If you're not prepared to maintain those standards, perhaps you'd be happier in a less regulated environment." The implication hung in the air like a threat. Sarah had heard the rumors about other families who'd been driven out by Margaret's enforcement campaigns. The Johnsons, who'd been cited 17 times in 6 months for various landscaping violations, until they finally gave up and moved to Arizona. The Martinez family, who'd been forced to repaint their house 3 times before Margaret approved the color. Community in Florida. 72 hours, Margaret repeated. "The clock starts now." Her entourage falling in behind her like a well-trained squad of suburban stormtroopers, Sarah watched them go, still clutching the violation notice. Rain soaking through her hair and running down her neck. But as she stood there in her backyard, an installation, something inside her shifted. For 8 years, she'd rolled over and taken Margaret's abuse. She'd been the perfect compliant resident, the model of suburban submission. Not this time. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed her neighbor, Tom Rodriguez, who lived 2 houses down and had been fighting his own battles with the HOA over his vegetable garden. "Tom," she said when he answered. "It's Sarah Marr." Staring at the ceiling and mentally organizing her battle plan. She'd spent most of the night reading through every page of Margaret's violation notice. She was dressed in her darkest jeans and a black hoodie, looking more like someone preparing for a covert operation than a suburban homeowner heading out for morning coffee, which she reflected as she grabbed her camera and notebook. Wasn't that far from the truth. Tom Rodriguez was already waiting at the corner of Elm and Maple when she arrived, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing a grin that belonged on a kid planning to egg the principal's house. "I haven't done reconnaissance this early since my Army days," he said, handing her one of the cups. "This is going to be fun." Sarah took a grateful sip of coffee and pulled out her notebook. "Okay, here's what I found last night. Margaret's house is at 847 Willowbrook Lane, according to the county records I pulled online. She's made several modifications in the last 5 years. What kind of modifications? A deck extension in 2019, a gazebo installation in 2021, a complete landscaping overhaul last year that included retaining walls and what looks like a water feature." Sarah flipped through her notes. "And here's the interesting part. I cross-reference the dates with the city permit database. Want to guess how many permits she pulled? Tom's eyebrows rose. How many? 0. Not a single one. Jesus. Tom whistled low. That deck alone should have required at least 3 different permits. Structural, electrical, if she added lighting, and environmental if it's over a certain square footage. They walked slowly down Willowbrook Lane, keeping to the sidewalk and trying to look like early morning joggers out for a casual stroll. Margaret's house was an imposing colonial painted in what Sarah had always assumed was an approved HOA color, pale yellow with white trim that managed to look both expensive and sterile. But as they got closer, Sarah began to notice details that her previous drive-bys had missed. "Look at that deck," Tom said, pulling out his phone and pretending to check messages while actually taking photos. "That's got to be at least 400 square feet. And see how it extends past the original roofline. That's definitely outside the setback requirements." Sarah was studying the landscaping with new eyes. "Those retaining walls," she said slowly. "How tall would you say they are?" 3 feet, maybe 4 in some spots. Anything over 3 feet, it requires engineering approval and a structural permit. Tom was grinning now. "And that water feature? Is that thing actually connected to the municipal water system?" Sarah looked closer. What she'd always assumed was a decorative fountain. Fountain was actually a sophisticated water feature with multiple levels and what appeared to be a permanent water line running from the house. If it is, she would have needed permits for plumbing modifications, not to mention environmental impact assessments if the runoff affects the neighborhood drainage system. Tom was taking pictures with the enthusiasm of a nature photographer who'd just spotted a rare bird. "Sarah, this is better than Christmas morning." They spent 20 minutes documenting everything visible from the street. Then Tom suggested they get Mrs. Patterson's perspective. Mrs. Patterson answered her door before they'd finished knocking, as if she'd been watching for them. "I've been waiting 40 years for someone to finally take that woman down a peg," she said without preamble, ushering them into her living room. "Coffee's fresh, and I've got Danish if you're hungry." "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah began, "last night you were holding up a photograph." "Oh, honey, I've got photographs." The elderly woman's eyes gleamed with mischief. "I've been documenting Margaret's little home improvement projects for years, just in case someone ever had the spine to challenge her." She disappeared into what sounded like a home office and returned with a thick photo album that she set on the coffee table with the satisfaction of a prosecutor presenting key evidence. "Started keeping records after she tried to get me cited for having too many bird feeders," Mrs. Patterson said, opening the album to the first page. "Said they were inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics and attracted undesirable wildlife. So I figured if she wanted to play games, the photographs were detailed, dated, and devastating." Mrs. Patterson had documented every phase of Margaret's home improvements, from initial construction to final installation. More importantly, she'd also photographed the complete absence. "This one's my favorite," Mrs. Patterson said, pointing to a photo dated 6 months ago. "See that gazebo? She built it right up to the property line. Has to be violating at least 3 different setback requirements." Sarah stared at the image. The gazebo was beautiful, elaborate, and clearly permanent, exactly the kind of structure that Margaret had just finished telling her was prohibited without Architectural Review Board approval. "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said slowly, "would you be willing to testify about what you've observed, if this goes to a hearing?" The elderly woman's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Honey, I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question for 15 years. Tom was studying another set of photos. "Sarah, look at this. She's got outdoor lighting that definitely wasn't part of the original electrical plan, and what looks like a full outdoor kitchen setup. That's commercial-grade equipment." "The outdoor kitchen went in last summer," Mrs. Patterson confirmed. "Took them 6 weeks and made noise from 7 in the morning until 6 at night. When I complained, Margaret told me that property improvements were temporarily inconvenient but ultimately beneficial to everyone's property values." Sarah felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. "Has she ever been cited for any of this?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Patterson snorted. "Margaret doesn't cite Margaret. She's been the HOA president for 12 years running, runs the elections like a dictator, and makes sure only her friends get on the ballot." Tom looked up from the photo album. "Wait, 12 years? What's the term limit?" Supposed to be 2 years with a maximum of 3 consecutive terms, Sarah said, pulling out her copy of the HOA bylaws. Let me check. Here it is. Section 8.2. No individual may serve as president for more than 6 consecutive years without a mandatory 2-year break in service. The three of them stared at each other. She's been serving illegally for 6 years, Tom said slowly. Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together. Oh, this is better than my soap operas. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her across-the-street neighbor, Kevin Walsh. Sarah, saw Margaret's committee at your place last night. Check your email when you get a chance. I sent you something you might find interesting. Sarah pulled up her email and found a message from Kevin, with 3 attachments. Photographs of Margaret's house taken from his drone. During his amateur photography, hobby flights over the neighborhood. The aerial shots revealed details that weren't visible from street level. The deck was even larger than they'd estimated, extending well beyond what should have been allowed. The gazebo was positioned in a way that clearly violated multiple setback requirements, and the water feature was part of an elaborate backyard renovation that had to have cost tens of thousands of dollars. But it was the 3rd photograph that made Sarah's breath catch. Tom, she said, turning her phone so he could see the screen, what does that look like to you? Tom squinted at the aerial image, then his eyes widened. Is that a swimming pool? Not just any swimming pool, Sarah said, zooming in on the image. That's a permanent in-ground swimming pool with what looks like a spa attachment and a pool house. Mrs. Patterson leaned over to look at the photo. She had that installed 3 years ago, told everyone it was a water feature for meditation, and property value enhancement took them 2 months to dig it out and another month to install all the equipment. Sarah felt her pulse starting to race. Mrs. Patterson, did you happen to document the pool installation? Honey, the elderly woman said with deep satisfaction, I documented everything. She flipped through the photo album to a section marked Pool Construction, 2022, and revealed a chronological documentation of what was clearly a major construction project. Excavation equipment, concrete trucks, tile installation, electrical work, plumbing, landscaping. The hallmarks of a permanent pool installation that would have required dozens of permits and inspections. Tom, Sarah said, her voice tight, with excitement, what would you estimate the cost of that installation? Tom studied the photos. Pool that size, with a spa and pool house, you're looking at least $80,000, maybe more if she went high-end on the equipment. Sarah was frantically taking notes, and the permits required construction, excavation, electrical, plumbing, environmental impact, safety inspections. Tom ticked them off on his fingers, plus architectural review for anything that's substantial. We're talking about at least 10D. By 10 a.m., Sarah's dining room table looked like the command center for a military operation. Spread across the polished wood surface were printed photographs, permit records, HOA bylaws, municipal code books, and a detailed timeline that Tom had helped her construct, documenting every one of Margaret's violations over the past 5 years. This is better than Christmas, Tom said, adding another photo to the evidence pile. I just got off the phone with my buddy at City Planning. Want to know how many violations Margaret's property represents? Sarah looked up from the violation. Notice she was drafting on her laptop. How many? 47 separate municipal code violations, ranging from unpermitted construction to environmental impact failures to electrical safety hazards. Tom was grinning like a kid who'd just found his parents' hidden Christmas presents. The fine structure alone would be ... He consulted his notes. Approximately $38,000 plus mandatory compliance costs. Sarah's fingers paused over the keyboard. $38,000? That's just the city fines. The HOA penalties would be separate. Tom pulled out a calculator. Let's see. Major structural violation. $500 per day times 3 years. Carry the two. We're looking at roughly $547,000. In retroactive HOA fines, $500,000, Sarah said softly. Mrs. Patterson, who had appointed herself as the operations chief intelligence officer, looked up from the photo album where she was flagging relevant pictures with sticky notes. She's had that illegal pool for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. I've been counting. Sarah saved her document and leaned back in her chair. The violation notice she'd been crafting was a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision, written in the same cold official language that Margaret had used to terrorize the neighborhood for over a decade. Every violation was documented, photographed, and cross-referenced with the exact HOA bylaw and municipal code it violated. But as satisfying as it would be to serve Margaret with her own medicine, Sarah knew that a simple violation notice wouldn't be enough. Margaret had spent 12 years building a system designed to protect herself and punish everyone else. She had allies on the HOA board, a network of supporters among the neighborhood's more authoritarian residents, and the confidence that came from never having been challenged. No. If Sarah was going to take down Margaret Thornfield, she needed to do it right, completely, permanently. "Tom," she said, "what would happen if someone filed a formal complaint with the city about all these violations? Full investigation. Property owner would have 30 days to pull permits and bring everything into compliance, or face escalating fines and possible legal action. And if they couldn't bring it into compliance," Tom's expression grew serious. "Forced removal of non-compliant structures. City would hire contractors to do the work and bill the property owner if they couldn't pay." He shrugged. "Liens, asset, seizure, potential foreclosure." Mrs. Patterson whistled. "That would wipe her out financially." Sarah nodded slowly. Margaret's house was her primary asset, the foundation of her wealth and status in the community. If she lost it, she'd lose everything: her position, her power, her ability to terrorize other people. "But," Sarah said, "that's just the city violations. What about the HOA stuff?" Tom consulted his notes again. "The unauthorized pool alone violates at least 6 different HOA regulations. The deck, gazebo, and outdoor kitchen add another dozen violations. And if she's really been serving as president beyond the term limits, ... double quotes, he trailed off, then his eyes widened. "Sarah, if she's been serving illegally, then technically every decision she's made as president for the last 6 years could be invalid." "Invalid how?" "Every violation notice, every fine assessment, every enforcement action, all of it done without legal authority." Tom was getting excited now. "We could challenge every citation she's issued to every resident for the past 6 years. Sarah felt something electric run through her. "How many people has she cited in 6 years? Mrs. Patterson was already reaching for another photo album. Apparently she'd been documenting more than just Margaret's construction projects. "Let me see. The Johnsons, 17 citations. The Martinez family, 12. The Chunes on Maple Street, 9. The elderly couple who moved to Florida, 14. She continued counting, flipping through pages of documentation. 63 families, Mrs. Patterson announced after several minutes. 63 families cited for a total of 428 violations over the past 6 years. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. 428 violations that could potentially be overturned, Tom said slowly, with fines refunded, plus interest and penalties for wrongful collection. Sarah was already reaching for her calculator. "What's the average fine amount?" "Varies," Mrs. Patterson said, consulting her records. "Minor violations start at $50. Major ones go up to $500. But most people get hit with multiple citations. ... double quotes, she paused, calculating. "I'd estimate an average of about $300 per violation." Sarah's calculator showed a number that made her blink twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that Margaret may have illegally collected over $100,000 in fines from the neighborhood, plus late fees, penalty assessments, and forced compliance costs?" Tom added. "Yeah, we're probably looking at well over $100,000. Mrs. Patterson closed her photo album with a satisfied thud. "So what's the plan?" Sarah stared at the evidence spread across her table. For 8 years, she'd been one of Margaret's victims, paying fines and jumping through hoops and accepting abuse because she thought she had no choice. But she wasn't the only one. 63 families had been put through the same harassment, forced to pay money they shouldn't have owed, driven from their homes by a woman who had no legal right to enforce anything. Margaret Thornfield had built her little empire on a foundation of fraud and intimidation. She'd counted on her victims, never fighting back, never investigating, never discovering that the person terrorizing them was living in violation of every rule she claimed to enforce. But Margaret had made one critical error. She'd targeted someone who knew how to research, how to plan, and how to coordinate a complex operation involving multiple moving parts. Sarah opened a new document on her, a laptop, and began typing. The plan, she said, is to file everything at once. City violations, HOA complaints, formal challenges to her authority as president, demands for refunds of illegally collected fines, and a call for a special election to remove her from office. Tom whistled. That's single quotes comprehensive. That's just the beginning. Sarah's fingers were flying over the keyboard now. Mrs. Patterson, how many of those 63 families do you think would be willing to join a class action complaint against Margaret? The elderly woman's smile was sharp as a blade. Honey, after what that woman has put people through, I think you'll be surprised how many people have been waiting for someone to give them a way to fight back. Sarah nodded. Tom, can you get me the contact information for a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes? Already on it, Tom said, pulling out his phone. My cousin's a real estate attorney. She's been waiting years for a case like this. As Sarah continued typing, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Kevin Walsh, the neighbor who'd sent the drone photos. Sarah, Kevin said without preamble, you need to see what's happening at Margaret's house right now. Sarah put the phone on speaker. What do you mean? She's got a landscaping crew here. Big one. They're pulling up all the evidence. Sarah, Tom, and Mrs. Patterson exchanged glances. What kind of evidence? Sarah asked. The retaining walls, the water feature, even parts of the deck. They're loading everything onto trucks and hauling it away. It's like she's trying to make the violations disappear. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. If Margaret was destroying evidence, it meant she knew something was coming. Someone had tipped her off. Kevin, can you get pictures? Already? But Sarah, you better move fast. At the rate they're working, half the evidence is going to be gone by this afternoon. Sarah ended the call and looked at Tom and Mrs. Patterson. She knows. How is that possible? Tom asked. Mrs. Patterson's expression was grim. 12 years as HOA president, she's got eyes and ears all over this neighborhood. Someone saw us this morning and reported back. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being cornered, the same feeling she'd had countless times when Margaret had shown up with violation notices and impossible demands. But this time was different. This time she had evidence. This time she had allies. And this time she was done playing defense. It doesn't matter, Sarah said, standing up and reaching for her jacket. We have photographs, we have witness testimony, and we have Mrs. Patterson's documentation going back years. She can destroy the physical evidence, but she can't destroy what we've already documented. Where are you going? Tom asked. Sarah grabbed her camera and the folder of evidence. To City Hall. If Margaret wants to play games, she's about to learn that some games have consequences. But as she headed for the door, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The Riverside County Planning Office was a study in bureaucratic efficiency, all beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Sarah sat across from Inspector Patricia Valdez, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had the tired eyes of someone who'd seen every possible way that people could violate building codes. This is quite a list, Inspector Valdez said, flipping through the 43 pages of documentation that Sarah, Tom, and Mrs. Patterson had assembled. Unpermitted pool, deck extension, gazebo, outdoor kitchen, electrical modifications, plumbing, alterations, environmental violations. She looked up at Sarah. You're certain about all this? Every violation is photographed and documented, Sarah replied. We have witness testimony spanning 5 years, aerial photographs showing the scope of the modifications, and documented proof that no permits were ever filed. Inspector Valdez made notes on her clipboard. The property owner Margaret Thornfield, she's the HOA president. For 12 years, Tom interjected, 6 years beyond the legal term limit. And she's been citing other residents for similar violations during this time period. 428 citations to 63 families, Sarah said, sliding another folder across the desk, all while living in violation of every rule she was enforcing. Inspector Valdez was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence. Then she picked up her phone and dialed an internal extension. It's Pat. I need a full inspection team at 847 Willowbrook Lane this afternoon. Full code compliance review. She paused, listening. Yeah, I know it's a rush job, but this one's different. After hanging up, she turned back to Sarah. Will, have a team out there by 2 o'clock. Full inspection, full documentation. If even half of what you've documented here is accurate, Ms. Thornfield is looking at the largest residential code violation case we've seen in 5 years. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was tempered by unease. Something about this felt too easy. Margaret Thornfield didn't maintain power for 12 years by rolling over when challenged. Her phone buzzed as they left the planning office. Another text from the unknown number. Final warning. Drop your current activities or face serious consequences. This is bigger than you understand. Sarah showed the message to Tom as they walked. To their cars, she's getting desperate, Tom said. Anonymous threats aren't exactly the actions of someone confident in their position, but as they drove back toward Willowbrook Commons, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach clench. The same black sedan from that morning was following them, staying exactly 3 cars back and matching their speed perfectly. Tom, she said into her Bluetooth. Don't look back, but we're being followed. What? Are you sure? Black sedan, license plate starting with 7G4. He's been behind us since we left City Hall. Tom was quiet for a moment. Sarah, take the next right and circle back toward the main road. Let's see if he follows. Sarah made the turn, and sure enough, the sedan followed. When she turned again, he turned. When she pulled into a shopping center parking lot, he drove past but parked at the gas station across the street where he had a clear view of her car. This is getting serious, Tom said as they sat in the parking lot. Maybe we should call the police and tell them that someone's driving on public roads behind us. Sarah shook her head. We need more than that. But even as she said it, she felt a chill run down her spine. Margaret wasn't just destroying evidence and making threats. She was having them followed. What else was she prepared to do? Sarah's phone rang, startling her. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. Ms. Chen. This is Janet Whitmore from the HOA board. We need to talk. Janet, the treasurer, the woman who'd stood beside Margaret the night before, helping document violations and making snide comments about community standards. What about? Sarah asked, not over the phone. Can you meet me at Starbucks on Elm Street in 20 minutes? Come alone. The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, trying to process what had just happened. Janet Whitmore, Margaret's right-hand woman, wanted to meet secretly. That was weird, Tom said when Sarah explained the call. Could be a trap. Or, Sarah said slowly, it could be that Margaret's support isn't as solid as she thinks it is. 20 minutes later, Sarah sat in a corner booth at Starbucks, nursing a coffee she didn't want and watching the door. Janet arrived exactly on time, looking nervous and checking over her shoulder before sliding into the seat across from Sarah. Thank you for coming, Janet said quietly. I wasn't sure you would. What do you want, Janet? Janet glanced around the coffee shop, then leaned forward. I know what you filed with the city today. Sarah kept her expression neutral. How do you know that? Margaret has, connections. People who keep her informed about anything that might affect the HOA. Janet's hands were shaking slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. She knows about your investigation. She knows about Mrs. Patterson's photographs. She knows about everything. Then why are you here? Janet was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee. When she looked up, her expression was haunted. Because 12 years ago, I believed in what Margaret was doing. I thought strict enforcement of community standards would protect our property values and maintain the neighborhood's character. She paused. I was wrong. Sarah waited, sensing that Janet needed to tell her story at her own pace. It started small, Janet continued. Minor violations, reasonable fines. But Margaret, she got a taste for the power, the control. And I watched her turn our community into her personal dictatorship. Why didn't you speak up? Because I was scared, Janet said simply. You've seen what she does to people who cross her. The harassment, the escalating citations, the systematic campaign to drive people out. I didn't want that directed at me. Sarah studied Janet's face. The woman looked genuinely distressed. but Sarah had learned not to trust anyone in Margaret's orbit. "What changed?" Sarah asked. Janet reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. "This morning, Margaret called an emergency board meeting. She told us about your city complaint and asked for our support in fighting it, and she presented her plan for dealing with you." Janet slid the folder across the table. "Sarah, this goes far beyond HOA violations. Margaret has been researching your personal life, your finances, your work history. She's planning to destroy you completely." Sarah opened the folder and felt her blood turn to ice. Inside were copies of her credit report, employment records, divorce proceedings, tax filings, and even medical records. Personal information that should have been private and protected. "How did she get this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She has a private investigator on retainer, someone she's used before when residents have challenged her authority." Janet's voice was shaking now. "Sarah, she's not just planning to fight your code violation complaint. She's planning to file harassment charges against you, claim that you've been stalking her and threatening her safety." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. "That's insane. I've done nothing but document public violations." "It doesn't matter. She has photographs of you taking pictures of her house. She has witness statements from concerned neighbors claiming you've been acting erratically and making threats." Janet leaned forward urgently. "She's going to claim that you're mentally unstable, that your divorce and financial troubles have made you vindictive and dangerous." Sarah's hands were shaking as she flipped through the documents. Everything was there: her ex-husband's infidelity, the financial strain of the divorce, the therapy sessions she'd attended to deal with the depression that followed. All of it twisted to paint a picture of an unhinged woman seeking revenge against innocent neighbors. "There's more," Janet said quietly. "She's planning to have you arrested." "For what?" "Trespassing, harassment, possibly breaking and entering. She's going to claim that you've been sneaking around her property, that you've made verbal threats, that you've been engaging in a pattern of escalating harassment." Janet's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Sarah, she has a police contact, someone who owes her favors. The arrest is scheduled for tonight." Sarah stared at Janet, trying to process what she was hearing. Margaret wasn't just fighting back, she was launching a full-scale assault designed to destroy Sarah's credibility, her reputation, and possibly her freedom. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. Janet was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "Because I can't be part of this anymore. What she's doing to you, what she's done to dozens of other families, ... It's wrong. It's criminal. And I've been enabling it for 12 years. Sarah's phone buzzed with another text. This time it was from Margaret herself, Ms. Chen, I believe. "It's time we had a direct conversation. Meet me at the community center at 8 p.m. tonight. Come alone. It's time to discuss your future in Willowbrook Commons." Sarah showed the message to Janet, who went pale. "Don't go," Janet said urgently. "It's a trap. The police will be waiting, and Margaret will have everything set up to make it look like you were threatening her." Sarah stared at the message, her mind racing. Margaret was trying to control the narrative, to set up a scenario where Sarah would look like the aggressor and Margaret the victim. It was a sophisticated... At 7:45 p.m., Sarah Chen stood in the parking lot of the Willowbrook Commons Community Center, watching shadows move behind the building's tinted windows. She wasn't alone. Tom Rodriguez sat in his car across the street with a clear view of all entrances. Mrs. Patterson was positioned in the coffee shop next door with her camera, and Janet Whitmore waited in her own vehicle at the far end of the parking lot, ready to serve as a witness to whatever was about to unfold. But most importantly, everything that happened in the next hour would be recorded and stored on servers that Margaret couldn't touch. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Tom. 3 police cars parked behind the building. "Margaret's not playing games," Sarah replied. "Neither am I starting the stream now." She activated the app and slipped the phone into her jacket pocket with the camera lens pointing outward. Then she walked toward the community center's main entrance, her heart pounding but her resolve steady. The community center was a modest building that served as the meeting place for HOA gatherings, neighborhood events, and the occasional town hall. Tonight, it felt like a courthouse where Sarah was about to stand trial for the crime of fighting back. Margaret Thornfield stood in the center of the main meeting room, dressed in her signature red blazer and wearing an expression of cold satisfaction. But she wasn't alone. Two police officers flanked her, one Sarah recognized as Officer Martinez. From the neighborhood, the other, a stern-looking woman with sergeant's stripes. "Ms. Chen," Margaret said, as Sarah entered, "this is Sergeant Davis, from the Sheriff's Department." Sarah nodded to both officers, acutely aware that her phone was recording every word. "Margaret, officers, I understand you wanted to discuss my future in Willowbrook Commons." Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. "Indeed, you see, Sarah May. I call you Sarah. We have a problem. A serious problem involving harassment, trespassing, and what appears to be an escalating pattern of threatening behavior." "I'm sorry, what?" Sarah kept her voice level, but inside she was marveling at Margaret's audacity. "Are you actually accusing me of threatening behavior?" "The evidence speaks for itself," Sergeant Davis said, consulting a folder that looked suspiciously similar to the one Janet had shown Sarah earlier. "We have multiple witness statements describing your erratic behavior over the past several days. Trespassing on private property to take unauthorized photographs, making verbal threats to neighborhood residents, engaging in what can only be described as stalking behavior. I've taken photographs of HOA violations from public property, which is completely legal. I've made no threats to anyone. Haven't you? What about this morning when you told Mrs. Patterson that you were going to destroy me? Those were private conversations, twisted and taken completely out of context." But more disturbing was the realization that Margaret had been monitoring those conversations somehow. "Those statements were taken completely out of context," Sarah said. "I was referring to challenging HOA violations through proper legal channels." "Or you?" Officer Martinez stepped forward, and Sarah noticed he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "Because we also have evidence of you conducting surveillance of Ms. Thornfield's property, taking detailed photographs, and coordinating with other residents in what appears to be a harassment campaign." Sarah realized with growing horror that Margaret had managed to twist every aspect of her legitimate investigation into evidence of criminal behavior. The documentation of violations became stalking. The coordination with neighbors became conspiracy. The legal complaints became harassment. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said. "Margaret Thornfield is living in violation of dozens of municipal codes and HOA regulations. Everything I've done has been to document those violations through proper legal channels." Margaret laughed, that same glass-breaking sound that had echoed across Sarah's backyard just 2 nights ago. "Oh, Sarah, still clinging to your little conspiracy theories? Officers, I think you'll find this interesting. Ms. Chen, can you explain why you've been taking detailed photographs of Ms. Thornfield's property from multiple angles over the past week?" Sarah looked at the photos. They were the same images she'd taken to document Margaret's violations, but presented without context, they looked exactly like what Margaret was claiming evidence of stalking and surveillance. "Those photographs document building code violations," Sarah said. "These claims?" Officer Martinez asked. Sarah reached for her bag, where she had copies of all the documentation she'd compiled. But as she did, Margaret made a sharp gesture with her hand. "Officers," Margaret said urgently. "She's reaching for something." Both police officers immediately tensed, their hands moving toward their weapons. "Ma'am, keep your hands visible," Sergeant Davis ordered. Sarah froze, suddenly understanding how thoroughly she'd been set up. Any movement she made could be interpreted as threatening. Any evidence she tried to present could be dismissed as the ravings of an unbalanced person. Margaret had orchestrated this entire scenario to make Sarah look dangerous and unstable. But Margaret had made one critical error. She'd been so focused on setting the perfect trap that she'd forgotten about Sarah's greatest asset, her ability to plan and coordinate complex operations. "Officers," Sarah said calmly, "I'd like you to know that this entire conversation is being live-streamed to the internet. Every word you've spoken, every action you've taken is being recorded and broadcast in real time." The room went dead. Silent. Margaret's face went white. "That's illegal. You can't record police officers without consent." "Actually," Sarah said, "California is a 2-party consent state for private conversations. But this is a public meeting in a community center. And more importantly, citizens have a constitutional right to record police interactions in public settings." Sergeant Davis looked uncertain. "Ma'am, you need to stop recording immediately." "No, I don't," Sarah said firmly. "And if you check your department's own policies, Officer Martinez was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Sergeant, maybe we should, Sarah," Margaret interrupted, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "You're only making this worse for yourself." "Am I?" Sarah pulled out her phone, making sure the camera was clearly visible. "Because in the past 5 minutes, you've made false accusations against me, attempted to have me arrested on trumped-up charges, and coordinated with police officers to silence a citizen who's exposed your criminal violations." "Criminal violations?" Sergeant Davis looked confused. "What criminal violations?" Sarah smiled. Margaret had just given her the perfect opening. Margaret Thornfield has been serving as HOA president for 12 years, 6 years beyond the legal term limit, making every enforcement action she's taken for the past 6 years illegal. She's collected over $100,000 in fines from neighborhood residents without legal authority. She's living in violation of 47 different municipal building codes while citing other residents for minor infractions. And most importantly, Sarah looked directly at the camera. She's just attempted to have me falsely arrested to cover up her crimes. Margaret's composure finally cracked. "You lying bitch." Officers arrest her for harassment and making false statements. But Officer Martinez was backing away, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Ma'am, we're going to need to verify these claims before we can take any action." "What's to verify?" Margaret screamed. "She's been stalking me. She's been making threats. I have witnesses." "Actually," came a voice from the doorway, "you don't." Everyone turned to see Janet Whitmore entering the room. Followed by Dave Morrison and Linda Chunda, other HOA board members Janet had mentioned. "Janet." Margaret's voice was strangled. "What are you doing here?" "What I should have done years ago," Janet said firmly. She walked to the center of the room and faced the police officers. "Officers, I'm Janet Whitmore, treasurer of the Willowbrook Commons HOA. I'm here to formally withdraw any complaints against Sarah Chen and to report that Margaret Thornfield has been engaging in fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of authority for over 6 years." Margaret stared at Janet as if she'd been struck by lightning. "You can't do this. You work for me. We work for the homeowners of this community, and you've betrayed that trust completely."
Linda.
Chen, the third board member, pulled out her own folder of documents. Serving beyond her legal term limit and using HOA resources to conduct